taxes, pot, and Schock. We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program on state politics and government and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Dave Dahl, State House reporter for WTAX Radio. Welcome, Dave.
Easy for you to say. Hello.
Hello. And a newbie here, Peter Hancock, reporter for Capital News, Illinois. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Thank you. And first off, this just in, within the last hour, Governor J.B. Pritzker has announced tax rates for his proposed progressive income tax that must first pass the legislature and then be approved by voters in the 2020 general election. Now, a lot of folks didn't think that the governor would actually introduce tax rates prior to the concept. There was some school of thought that rather than come up with particulars, he would come up with a concept, then have that approved, put into the Constitution, which now bans anything but a flat tax. And we iron out the details later. So this is something of level of detail that perhaps some folks hadn't expected. Dave, give us the particulars. What are the numbers?
Well, and this affects all three of us. If you make $250,000 or more, you will be paying more in taxes. That's when things start to go up. Mm-hmm. Everyone else will stay at 4.95 or get a bit of a cut. Not a huge cut, but some. Yeah.
I mean, us being millionaires, we're going to
we're getting at the worst.
We're getting at the worst. Well, I mean, in point of fact, I think, Dave, you're right. This is a tax cut, I think perhaps in, not in this theory, but it's a 0.05% cut, I think, for most folks. And for example, the tax rate now is a flat 4.95%. If you make $0 to $10,000, your tax would be 4.75%. And 0.2% on that level of income, that's not
significant.
That's not a lot of Big Macs. Then if you make $10,000 to $100,000, it's 4.9%, a 0.05% cut. Again, not a big hill of beans. And then if you're $250,000, $4.95%, it stays the same. And then it goes up to the point where if you're over $1 million, it's a 7.95% tax on the whole enchilada. And that would amount, I think, if you're making $5 million a year, that's a $150,000 tax increase.
Yeah, that's a pretty good year for me anyway.
Yeah. Should rich people be worried? Go ahead.
Well, I think the interesting thing is there are a lot of different ways you could write a proposed constitutional amendment, and I don't know that lawmakers have even gotten to that chapter of the story yet. They're just trying to build support for the concept of a graduated tax. So it's unclear, are they actually going to bake these rates into the Constitution so that they can't change over time? Because $250,000 a year is a lot of money now, but 20 years from now it may be less. So there are a lot of ways, and one person that I talked to suggested you could simply remove the provision of the current Constitution that says you can't have, or you must have a non-graduated tax structure. You could just take that out, leaving lawmakers the flexibility to establish however many brackets they want at whatever breaking points and whatever tax rates they want.
Dave?
Well, I think we saw in Missouri that their top tax rate is something like $6,000 or $9,000. They made the mistake of putting them in. I think
a dollar figure.
Right. They'll probably do more what Peter said and just make it simple and let the legislatures of the future work out the details. Of course, when you have a constitutional amendment, when you have a referendum, the winner is the person holding the magic marker up at the easel. I guess now it would be a Sharpie, but nevertheless, exactly how it'll be written is up for discussion. What will be in it? There are already campaigns for and against the graduated tax that presumably we'd be voting on in the year 2020 after it would have passed each chamber of the General Assembly by a 3/5 vote.
Correct.
After, I'm sure, it'll be robust debate.
Well, it'll be going to be robust debates. I mean, I frankly would be a bit surprised if they did bake the percentages into the Constitution.
They're smarter than that, aren't they?
Well, you know, one wonders at times. You know, the thing about it is that this reminds me, on some level, of Mike Madigan's infamous millionaires tax that was put before the voters for an advisory referendum, and folks like the idea of taxing millionaires. That perhaps wouldn't have passed constitutional muster because it would have been, in effect, a progressive income tax, which is banned by the Constitution. It's supposed to be a flat one. And so maybe that was kind of a test case, going back several years, about how do we feel about taxing millionaires. If you're not a millionaire, it's probably a good idea. If not, well, not such a great idea. End of the day, this raises, according to the governor's figures, I think $3.4 billion. Does that get us out of the budget hole, or do we have a little more of a hump to go?
I think overall there are structural problems, and this, according to the governor, would help. I don't think anyone thinks that it'll solve everything, but the argument for it is that it goes, a good distance toward it.
The structural budget hole, he has said, is around $3.2 billion.
Okay, 3.2.
So that gets, if it's 3.4, 3.5.
On paper, it's $200 million ahead.
Yeah, it gets you somewhat out of the hole. Now, most state governments would like to end their fiscal year with what's called an ending balance, a little bit of money in the bank, just in case last-minute expenses or whatever. You never know what's going to happen. Some states put that into a rainy day fund. Illinois has not had that luxury for a long time, so I think the bond markets would probably like to see the state, have a little bit of cash at the end of the year. But these tax projections, the revenue projections that come in, these are highly variable. Sometimes they pan out, sometimes they fall significantly short. So you have to wait and see whether or not this particular tax structure actually would generate the kind of revenue he's talking about, or if lawmakers and the public are willing to go along with that particular structure or something else.
I'm hearing lots of ifs here. If this, if that. I mean, this is a giant if, isn't it? I mean, first off, we have to get the legislature to agree.
Well, the governor said he's still willing to negotiate, and maybe this is just the first step in the negotiations. I don't know what there is to negotiate because Republicans hate it, business groups hate it. In fact, one of the House Republicans, Grant Worley, said there's nothing to negotiate. All it is negotiating how I'm going to go out of business. He said the Republicans aren't even going to show up.
Well, they don't even need to show up.
They don't need to.
Yeah, there's what I believe they can lose 3 or 4 Democratic votes in the House, similar number in the Senate.
They've got the super duper majority in both chambers. They can do whatever they want. And you might say that's a trope, but that's exactly what happened with the minimum wage. There was no bipartisanship on the vote, no matter what the governor says.
Well, that sort of assumes that all Democrats stay on the same page, and Democrats are nothing if not somewhat of a disorganized party at times. And I do think there's something about the political culture of Illinois being wedded to this flat tax rate where everybody is treated the same, whether you're rich or poor, you pay the same tax rate. That's kind of how we treat property taxes, whether you live in a $50,000 house or a $1 million mansion. The tax rate that applies to your property is the same. But income taxes have traditionally, in most jurisdictions, been treated differently. In the states that have income taxes, and not all of them do, most of the states have graduated income tax rates. The federal government uses a graduated rate. Many tiers in the federal tax code. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see if you can get past that cultural block that a lot of people in Illinois have about the fact that one flat tax rate for everybody is, to some people's minds, the definition of fairness.
Sure. I mean, yeah, that's true. Do you think that the governor now is recalling or remembering the Ogilvy experience, Richard Ogilvy from the 1970s? He was the governor that instituted an income tax. He was a one-termer. I mean, this is dangerous fire to be playing with. How might that be entering into his thinking? Any thoughts?
Somebody, and I forget who, said that the governor came in not necessarily because he was so great and loved, it's because he wasn't Rauner. And
kind of like how Rauner came in because he wasn't Quinn.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But I think Governor Pritzker probably thinks of this as more than one term, and he thinks that his plan is going to be popular enough to continue to carry him, especially if he continues to sell it as taxing only the top 3% of earners. He stood in front of a giant sign that said in big letters 97%. And you know there's a big campaign that is going to make sure everybody knows that number.
Fair enough. You know, but I'm looking at the figures, and I don't have them right in front of me here, but they were showing different scenarios, what this impact would be in terms of both your income tax, if you had kids, and your property tax. And for the folks that are making, you know, anywhere between $10 and $250,000, there's not that much oomph here, particularly when it comes to property tax relief. And property taxes are something that, as we all know, are amongst the highest in the nation. This doesn't get us very far toward property tax relief. Is that going to be an issue at all? I mean, can he deliver income tax, you know, raise $3.4 million and provide significant property tax relief?
Well, I think clearly a lot of his budget is riding on this graduated tax, or a lot of his long-term
yeah, because he can't ride on it this time.
He can't do it this time. He also has legalized pot sitting back there in the background, and he has expanded gambling, sports gambling, all these other things that he says will bring in significant new revenue. So once all these things are combined, maybe there's some property tax relief. But again, I think the financial priorities of the state is you have to pay down $8 billion of unpaid bills, and you have to pay down the $130 billion or whatever unfunded liabilities in the pension system. So I think property tax relief, even if the state were to strike it rich through this thing, I think property tax
Maybe
relief,
the state could buy a lottery ticket. I don't know.
is not. It's probably not the highest priority right now.
Well, I mean, and we also have to consider, at least I think, the possibility here that we've lost, what, 4% of our state's population we've lost 4% of population since 2013. There was a recent article in the Wall Street Journal that was trying to analyze the effect of federal changes in the federal tax code, which eliminated a lot of the deductions for local and state taxes that can currently be taken in high tax states such as Illinois, New York, a few others. Illinois ranked number 2 in the number of folks who have left the state of Illinois and high wage earners in the last year since these federal tax changes came about, or at least were announced, with Florida benefiting. Are there going to be any millionaires left to foot the bill?
I think that's a dangerous connection to draw, and a lot of people are doing it right now.
Sure.
They say Illinois has high taxes, Illinois is losing population, therefore it's the high taxes that are driving the population away. People don't necessarily move across country or even across a state border simply to avoid taxes. There's a lot of other things that go into it. I think it's generally true that middle America is losing population to the east and west coasts. Some of the states are able to make that up, quite frankly, with international migration. I don't know exactly what Illinois' situation is on that, but there are other Midwestern states and plain states that have large beef packing industries and other kinds of industries. They're attracting international immigration, and that sort of offsets the population loss. But the fact of the matter is, young kids today, the Gen Zers, I guess you call them, millennials, are by and large leaving middle America and going elsewhere where there are better jobs, different culture, I don't know, maybe different climate, whatever. But this is a trend I think all of middle America is kind of struggling with right now.
Well, in 2019, there are many, many people who can live wherever they want. And it makes it easy to leave.
Well, fair enough, you know, and we've seen some figures recently about higher ed stats. I mean, Western Illinois University, for example, just announced a round of pretty significant layoffs. And you look at the figures about, well, why are they laying folks off? Because they don't have nearly as many students as they once did. Meanwhile, the governor has said, I'm going to put more money into higher education than we're currently investing now. Is spending more money on higher ed going to keep more kids at home? Is that going to turn around these enrollment declines in institutions of higher learning, or is the horse already left that barn?
I think spending more money on student financial aid and spending more money to hold down the cost of tuition will go a long ways toward keeping people at home. and that seems to be one of the biggest drivers. And I covered a Illinois Board of Higher Education meeting earlier this week, and they were talking about significant drop-offs, particularly among African Americans. And one of the things is that, you know, when the cost of higher education goes up and the availability of financial aid is flat, stagnant, or goes down as it has, especially during the 2-year budget impasse, then, you know, it's the people who are initially least able to afford college to begin with who start dropping off the student enrollment list. And so that's happening not only in Illinois, but in a lot of places that haven't kept up with investments in higher education to keep up with the rising cost of education.
I mean, I think that's a good point. I mean, the in-state tuition for Illinois, I think, is around $12,000 a year, which is a pretty good bargain if you can compare it with private institutions. But if there's no financial aid, 12 grand is still a bridge too far for a lot
Well,
of
and
folks.
we're all probably within walking distance of folks whose kids are going to Alabama or Mississippi, the places that are raiding Illinois.
Or Indiana or Wisconsin. You know, it's kind of a vicious cycle. And one of the other things you find is you would think that going to a private university like Notre Dame or one of the Ivy League schools would be infinitely more expensive. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at their tuition, the net cost of going there after your scholarships and your financial aid, the different packages, because the private schools are very well endowed, sometimes the net cost of going there is less than it is going to a public institution.
Well, absolutely, for the Ivy Leagues in particular. I mean, it's a need-blind thing, and they take your income tax returns and they say, okay, it's very generous in terms. It's oftentimes cheaper to go to Yale or Harvard than it is to go to UIS if you're of moderate means. I want to circle back a second here on the question of finances, revenue, and whatnot. The business community has come out against the progressive income tax. At the same time, and this is out, I think, a little more than a week ago, the Civic Federation, very much a pro-business entity up in Chicago, says tax retirement income, start taxing services, which is not a new concept in the state of Illinois. It almost seems like it's an impenetrable concept for state government to absorb
It's
and
a
actually
third rail politically.
Well, especially retirement income. Why on services though? Why is that such a tough nut to crack when business interests are saying do that, not this?
People are okay with the concept of taxing the sale of a thing, but taxing a service just sort of falls into a whole different category. And I actually covered this in a different state just a year or two ago. Kansas was looking at this, and you get into all kinds of class warfare about, well, you know, if you start taxing haircuts, you know, it falls heaviest on the poor. But then, you know, then people try and play class warfare things about, you know, taxing day spas or, you know, skyboxes at Soldier Field or something like that.
You can pick and choose.
yeah.
You can let haircuts go and tax the skyboxes.
Yeah, and there's a whole laundry list that goes by, they go by economic codes that the federal government uses for all these different services. And you'll see people pick things out, and it's clearly just kind of nitpicking and getting at some sort of class warfare, saying, I want to tax these people, but I don't want to tax those people. It gets very dicey to start wading into those waters.
It seems to me that's big in Iowa, isn't it? Don't Iowa and Wisconsin have a bunch of those service taxes?
Most states do. Most states do tax services because service economies now, I mean, that's the economies have shifted here, and so we're much more a service-oriented economy than we were 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Well, the part I don't understand about the retirement income, why don't they say, come to Illinois, we don't tax retirement income? They don't seem to make that up something they want to shout from the rooftops. They don't want to tax retirement income. Maybe they should put ads in the AARP magazine or whatever, say, come to Illinois, your retirement income is safe with us.
Or you can go to Florida where they don't tax income at all, or you can go to Nevada where they don't tax income at all, and you can shiver your way through their winter. No, wait a minute, they don't do that.
Yeah, they also don't have polar vortexes
They don't have
in
polar
Florida,
vortexes.
so that's a big selling factor.
Let's move the subject entirely. Aaron Schock. he is perhaps not skating, but he's in the clear now as far as going to prison. The criminal charges are going to be dismissed. Surprised or not?
No.
Why not?
The prosecutors messed up the case almost from the get-go. Prosecutors and the judges messed it up. Aaron lawyered up, and delay. A couple of changes of venue, change of judge. It was never going to trial at this point. And, I think the victory for the government is they got him responsible for something slightly more serious than jaywalking. He didn't plead guilty to anything, but his campaign did, just to one misdemeanor. And he's got to pay, I think, a $25,000 fine.
$25,000, yeah.
Plus $110,000 to the IRS and to his campaign fund. And
Plus $1 million to his lawyers, but go ahead.
I was going to say that $110,000 is probably a pittance compared to what he owes his lawyers. And he said in Chicago, when asked how he was going to pay for it, he said, well, I've got a legal defense fund, and I was good at raising money until this happened, and now I really kind of find out who my friends are.
Is he dead politically? Probably.
People believe in redemption in second acts. Maybe if he has a cooling off period, if he goes away for a while and then comes back on the scene, I think he might live in California a good part of the time. Maybe he could run for something out there. I mean, when you think of the comparison is made to Jesse Jackson Jr., who got prison time,
Correct.
unlike Schock. And what Jackson's problem was that he spent campaign money on frivolous things like elk heads and Michael Jackson souvenirs.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, if I'm a donor, all I want you to do is to take my call. Someone like Jesse Jackson Jr. is raising all kinds of money, and he's not opposed. He is unopposed in races. There's no credible opponent against him. He's going to win, yet he's got this big war chest. And if I am Joe, big donor, do I care that he bought an elk head? And
No. But I mean, Aaron Schock didn't have any real credible opponents. I mean, he was a shoo-in. His danger was that he might have become more than a congressman. I mean, there were thoughts about him perhaps running for governor. I mean, he was young. He was a politician on the make. So I mean, he was perhaps more a threat to folks who have political juice than Mr. Jackson was.
well, the governor, Governor Rauner, is thought to have been behind a dark campaign against Schock. I mean, you're getting things in the mail that would discourage a governor Schock, and Schock wound up not running for governor, of course. And I think really when you get to where he was in Congress, I think his trajectory slowed down a little bit when people like Eric Cantor went by the wayside, and the group that Schock was in only wanted him to raise money for him, but he wasn't really on any kind of leadership path.
I mean, look at the damage that was done. As you point out, the prosecution had screwed this up. I mean, it was the U.S. Attorney's Office in Central Illinois looks horrible on this. They were accused of prosecutorial overreach. And then the prosecutor who was accused of doing this by then judge, well, he's still a judge, Colin Bruce, didn't take kindly to being told that he had screwed this up. So then he turned the judge in to the Inspector General for writing impertinent emails to members of the U.S. Attorney's Office, which has resulted in the judge being placed on the sideline, so to speak, can no longer hear criminal cases. Aaron Schock looks better almost than anybody else out of this.
You could argue that, and when you say, is there a political future for him? If he wants to, why not? And one lesson I've learned, I've known Aaron Schock since he was 19 years old, write-in campaign for school board. The president of the board had him kicked off the ballot, and he ran as a write-in and beat her.
Yeah.
Ever since then, if you get between him and something he wants, you draw back a bloody stump.
Yeah.
So I would never bet against him.
Yeah.
I never thought this was going to trial.
Fair enough. Moving right along, we've got just a few minutes left. I'm still infatuated, perhaps overly so, with the issue of recreational marijuana and its path toward legalization here in Illinois. What the legislature is talking about now is who should be allowed to grow this, how many folks should be allowed to grow this, what's at stake, what might happen.
Well, that's a good question. I was kind of surprised that when the subject of legalizing the use of marijuana came up, they also started talking about domestic production of marijuana.
Yeah.
I can tell you that in Colorado, I've been told at different times after they legalized marijuana and the domestic production of it that you can't find warehouse space anywhere in the Denver metropolitan area because it's all used up. All consumed by indoor cultivation of marijuana. So there are significant side effects of doing this. It does
Economic side effects.
Economic side effects. It distorts real estate markets. It changes real estate markets in ways that are often very hard to predict. But of course, you have to allow domestic production because it's still against federal law. And you can't ship it across
go outside
state
borders.
lines, so you would have to produce it internally. But the idea of people growing 5 or 6 plants in their own home, I'm starting to think I didn't get a big enough apartment for that. So
Get one with a basement.
And I'm not sure how far that's going to go. But I think Governor Pritzker makes a point that everybody basically knows, which is that people are smoking marijuana.
He's figured that part out.
And you don't have to walk very far on the streets of Chicago to realize that people are smoking marijuana. And from a criminal justice standpoint, while the rates of usage of marijuana don't vary much across ethnic groups or races, the number of arrests, law enforcement is much stricter on the African American and minority community than they are on middle class white kids, white college kids, and so there is a criminal justice, social justice kind of aspect to that.
Well, I mean, what I'm kind of thinking about is that it's been largely decriminalized. You go to Washington State, for example, where it's been an almost anything goes sort of thing. There's 1,100 cultivation licenses, and the price of marijuana has gone down to $40 an ounce retail, which is almost free. And I'm reading this story in the Chicago Tribune recently, a medical marijuana patient who's paying $45 for a quarter ounce of low-grade marijuana for his medicinal purposes. So, I mean, it's something that's probably going to get sorted out. I would expect law of supply and demand versus monopoly, but that's probably something we'll have to consider later because we are out of time. And so thanks for joining us at Capitol View, and we'll see you next week.